Hello everybody, it's Refresh, and I am here to take a look at the Savage Hunger Brawl deck for Magic the Gathering. On the back it says, Brawl is an exciting multiplayer format in which each deck is built around a powerful legendary creature or planeswalker. For Savage Hunger it says, for his greed, Korvold, once a human king, was cursed to live as an insatiable dragon, devour your resources to feed and empower Korvold, then unleash his monstrous appetite on your opponents. Contents include a 60-card Brawl deck, life wheel, deck box, and informational insert. Let's go ahead and check out those contents. There's our informational insert. Contains the rules for Brawl, and then some tips. And on the back we have information about each of the decks, which I don't know why it's in here because we already bought one, hopefully because that's the deck that we wanted. Here's our premium foil Korvold Fae-Cursed King. For 2 black, red, green, you get a legendary creature Dragon Noble. Flying, whenever Korvold Fae-Cursed King enters the battlefield or attacks, sacrifice another permanent. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. So this is a sacrifice themed set. There's our deck box with Korvold on the cover. Let's take a look at its contents. We have a spacer in here. We have a card divider, a counter, and then we have our deck. Alright, there's a bit of value here as well as the sacrifice theme. I'll play this deck against its peers and I'll be back to let you know what I think. Alright, so I had a chance to play with this deck a bit and I have some thoughts. The first thing we have to do is to take a look at our commander. We have Korvold Fae-Cursed King. It's a 4/4 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, sacrifice another permanent. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. Now this is notable from the Brawl decks because this is the one creature that actually saw competitive play amongst all the commanders of the Brawl decks. And it's because there was a strong sacrifice themed deck in the standard meta, particularly that abused things like the Cat and Witch's Oven combo with Mayhem Devils and things like that to like kill your opponent by multi-sacking things. Now this is a Brawl deck and it's singleton, and so you're not going to be able to have that, but it is kind of weird that the Cat didn't feature somewhere in this deck because we have the Witch's Oven here. Maybe that would have made this deck possibly too strong, but it is something to keep track of. So it's obvious that sacrificing is the theme here. You want to do a lot of sacrificing. You can sacrifice any permanent when Korvold is attacking or enters the battlefield. And that's a distinction that is going to become very important very quickly, because when you have a sacrifice-oriented deck, you need things to sacrifice. And so there are 2 types of things that this deck primarily generates as sacrifice fodder. There are token creatures, which you can get from Krenko and the Chittering Witch. I believe those are the only token creatures that you can get. You can get 1 red goblins whenever Krenko attacks, and then you can get 1 black rats. And that's it. Or you can sacrifice food. And that is generated by things like the Gluttonous Troll, amongst other things. And so those are the 2 things that you are going to be sacrificing. I guess you also have Rapacious Dragon's Treasures, but mostly it's food and tokens. I guess the Dreadhorde Invasion also creates 1 zombie token that keeps growing every turn. So I gotta keep that in mind as well. So there are 3 basic sources for creature tokens, and then there's a handful of other sources for food and or treasure. This is going to be important because some of these effects that sacrifice care about whether it's a creature or not that you're sacrificing, and others just care about sacrificing anything in general. Korvold himself sacrifices about anything in general, and that's really strong because you sacrifice treasure or you sacrifice food to get something, and then Korvold gets stronger as a result of that. And so I think one of the reasons why it was done this way, where you don't have a ton of tokens entering the battlefield, is specifically because Korvold may have been too busted because of that. There's another sub-theme going on here that deals with +1/+1 counters, and I think that that is one of the deck's errors. I don't think that the +1/+1 counter sub-theme is very strong here, And the cards that are supporting that are the Woodland Champion, which also supports the token theme, which is kind of weak in this deck. And so I wish that there were more ways to generate creature tokens, because those are the things that you get the most benefit sacrificing, right? Priest of Forgotten Gods cares if you sacrifice creatures. Tutoring Witch cares if you sacrifice creatures. The Plague Crafter wants you to sacrifice a creature. And so the fact that sometimes you're not sacrificing creatures because you don't have any creatures to sacrifice that are worth sacrificing does make this a little bit more complicated. But there are some good creatures that are good fodder to sacrifice anyways. For example, the Pollen Bright Druid has a one-time effect when it enters the battlefield, and it's a 1/1 body, so you can just sacrifice that. Like, it proliferates, and we'll get back into the +1/+1 counter theme here. The Orzhov Enforcer leaves a 1/1 flyer behind when it dies. Goblin Crater Maker and Thrashing Brontodon both can sack themselves for effects. And so that all works out fine in terms of creating additional bodies that you can sacrifice. But the thing about this deck that does kind of annoy me is that there is this 1/1 counter theme, but it doesn't seem to do a lot with this deck. I mean, Korvold gets it, but aside from getting bigger, which I guess is a payoff in itself, there's not a lot of ways to spread out on those counters. And then even when you have those counters, going bigger and not having evasion, I guess Korvold is the example of something that does have evasion, does mean that, you know, you can just get chumped indefinitely, and that's not that great of value. So the cards here that specifically care about that are the Pollen Bright Druid, which give +1/+1 counters. You have an Evolution Sage that can proliferate, which so you can get more counters on everything that has counters. The Dreadhorde Invasion only creates one token. After that, it amasses, which means it gets another +1/+1 counter. And that's not that great because you're constantly wanting to sacrifice this thing. And then once you have a zombie token, then are you really thinking about sacrificing that? I don't know, because the benefit of having a big creature is so good. I guess you can proliferate to put more counters on that, but it's not that great of a thing. I like the Moldavine Reclamation a lot because whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life and draw a card. When you sacrifice creature tokens, you gain a lot of life and draw cards. And so, again, Krenko and Chittering Witch are great examples of what you can gain from sacrificing creatures more than, you know, sacrificing whatever else. Krenko is a little annoying because he only gets counters when he attacks, and so you do have to find other ways to put counters on him. And maybe that's the reason why we have this +1/+1 theme, so that one of your few reliable sources of creating creature tokens can actually create creature tokens, but he still has to attack to create those tokens. And so it's one of the downsides of this deck. But there are some good payoffs for having that besides just Korvold, because you have Judith and Mayhem Devil pinging things as creatures die. Priest of Forgotten Gods can get you mana, draw cards, and cause your opponents to sacrifice creatures. Yes, you have to sacrifice 2 other creatures for that to work, but that's not bad. We have outlets for sacrifice all over the place with Priest, the Witch's Oven, Chittering Witch, Gluttonous Troll, as well as Korvold himself. And so that's all good as well. But I kind of wish that this +1/+1 counter theme was less of a thing and that there was just more ways to generate creatures. The Rhythm of the Wild is also a card that I think is primarily in here to play towards the +1/+1 counter theme, because when you play a creature on the battlefield, they can either have haste or they can enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counter. And I think that it's in here primarily for the +1/+1 counter side, and it only benefits non-token creatures. Whew. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the utility parts of this deck. I guess Finality is a Wrath, and the fact that all the creatures get -4/-4, but you get to put counters on something before that happens. So maybe that is the Wrath. And then you have Little Target Removal and Death Sprout and Bake into a Pie. And then Taste of Death is like a weak Wrath because each player sacrifices 3 creatures. You're someone that can get benefit from that because, again, Korvold and some of the other, care about sacrificing creatures, payoffs are there. Now, this deck is one of the decks that did end up succeeding the most, so I'm not saying that this is a weak deck by any stretch of the imagination, but I wish that the themes worked together just a little bit better so that this deck could really go off a bit more. Other weaknesses about the deck, besides what I pointed out already in terms of the themes not coming together that well, include the mana base. Like with all the Brawl decks, this mana base is full of a lot of basics, and then you have the full complement of Guild Gates and Game Lands, which is fine. It's not great that they're tap lands because it does mean that this deck is a little slow. You have a command tower, which is great. You have a single temple, which is the Temple of Malady. It is a tap land, but at least it scries, and that makes it a lot better than all of these other tap lands. But I would gladly have all the temples and all the shock lands. Stomping Ground is probably the best land in the deck versus having these basics in the deck. There's also Cryptic Caves in this deck, and that lets you get an additional card draw, but I found that sometimes it can be annoying that it only generates colorless mana in a 3-color deck. So that is the basics of this deck. I think that with a little bit of alteration, it can be an even stronger deck. And the thing that you're really looking out for is a way to make more creature tokens than having to rely on Krenko and Dreadhorde Invasion. That's not a lot of cards in your deck that do that. And at some point, you're going to run out of the easily throwawayable creatures. And you're going to find yourself wishing that you had more fodder to sacrifice in order to get its various effects here. In addition to that, we have, the cheap cardboard deck box. It's nice that it fits sleeved cards. It got some damage from just sitting around on other deck boxes, so that was a little weird. And then it has this divider, which I just used to separate Korvold from the rest of the deck. I don't know what else it could be used for. And I like this life counter, except for the fact that it's on 2 sides, like 20 points on each side, which is a little bit annoying. And I also found it a little bit annoying that it only goes up to 40 at the end. But it is nice to be able to easily counter life like this. And, the spin down counter is a little bit harder to manipulate. And so this is decent for what it is. That is all. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you can hit subscribe. This was Refresh. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.